So we've got some people coming in, Scott. So good morning to all of you. Paul, good to see you again.
Ryan, Mary,
Mary,
Arseni.
Todd.
Hello.
Hey, some people are still checking in. There were about 50 people registered for the second workshop, so I'll monitor and let folks in as they show up. But in the meantime, Daryl, maybe we go ahead and rock on since our time is so limited today.
Cool. And Tom's joining us. I don't know what time that is for you, Tom.
Same as Ryan, right?
Same as Ryan.
Up early, 6 a.m.
Well, let's begin. Thanks for joining Scott and I and the rest of the community here. We are on this second webinar exclusive for the people who have put their hands up to get the pre-orders of the Field Guide to Better Results, which co-edited by Scott, myself, Sam Mullen, and Mark Hubble. Sam's a new addition from the first book that we did from Better Results. We're so glad to have his inputs this round all the way from UK, so it's quite kind of a good spread from different continents that we have with people. We also did the first webinar. For those of you who have missed that a couple of weeks ago, the link will be sent to you, or sorry, it has already been sent to you. Make sure you check your inbox in case you did not receive it. Go through your spam just in case, or your promotions folder. If you're using Gmail, it should be there. And if you don't have that, please let us know so that we can make sure that's available to you. And today, Scott,
yes.
Good morning to you.
Hey, good evening to you.
And you've been traveling, you've been back on the travels as we've been talking this before we got on this call. How have you been?
Yeah, good. I was in Denmark and Sweden this last week. We taught a combined intensive, fit intensive, and then what we're now calling fit consultation rather than supervision. It's a development that comes out of our rewrite of the manuals and an attempt to make sure that clinicians still have access to the kind of traditional supervision that they enjoy, but also which research questions its impact on the outcomes of therapists. Seems fairly good at learning new methods. There is a meager amount of evidence that it helps clinicians avoid burnout, but in terms of a direct connection with outcomes, it really just doesn't do the job. But we also noticed when we started teaching fit supervision, and they were implementing it within large agencies in the public sector, some of the managers said, well, since you're getting fit supervision, you really don't need the other kind. And that we thought was a big mistake. So we're now calling it clinical consultation.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, that's a bit of more of an active coaching consult kind of plant, isn't it? And I think it all depends on what an individual needs and depending on where the growth edge is at, which is what we're going to focus on a little bit more on about today. But I'm going to go specifically into some of the pre-readings that we have sent to you. And this is going to be more about chapters 3 and 5. And chapters 3 and 5. 3 is about Klein factors. Did I get that right, Scott? Or
You did. You did.
It's nighttime. I'm still making sure that I'm not getting things upside down. Klein factors is chapter 3. Chapter 5 is about relationship factors, written by John Norcross and his colleague. And chapter 3, Klein factors, we have Joshua Swift, Scott, and who's the other one again?
Jesse Owen.
Of course, Jesse Owen, excellent researcher. So we're gonna go a little bit knee deep and get into the weeds about these two things, because they have two very important topics on Klein factors as well as about the relationship. Now, we all know that therapeutic relationship is important, but the nuance has been spelled out is so critical. So I think a good way to begin, Scott, maybe let me just ask you, start with the Klein factors chapter, right?
Okay.
Well, what stands out to you? What's one thing that really stands out to you from that chapter?
So I think with all of these chapters, and the whole purpose behind the field guide was for us to do two things. One was to do a deep dive on each of the factors that have leverage on outcome, because deliberate practice really isn't about achieving proficiency or mastery. It's about reaching beyond what you're currently able to do. So of course you have to measure your results, find where the deficits are, and then once you know the deficits, we have to map those on to which factor might have the most leverage on outcome. And perhaps the largest one is client factors. If you do a little simple math, then you know that treatment, everything encompassed accounts for about 13% of the variance in outcome. That leaves 87% of the variance outside of that. That's sort of the holy grail. Everyone claims that they can tap into that. We tasked Jesse and Joshua with reviewing that literature and talking with us about, well, what principles, and that's the second piece here, what principles could they distill after a literature review that clinicians could follow, operationalize in their unique ways that might have leverage on outcome and the ability to fill those deficits for the individual clinician. And to me, they've done an amazing job, a big deep dive. First, they review the literature, then they distill the principles, and then they give some exercise to help with those principles. I guess I'm going far afield from what your question was here, Daryl, but I will say that part of the reason for doing this is we have some competition, and that is a competing view of what deliberate practice is. One that, as we mentioned in the last webinar, I believe conflates a different notion about practice, something called purposeful practice, which again is really about rehearsing something until you achieve a certain proficiency or pre-established level of competence. That's the sort of alternate view. We're saying something, I think, fairly different. Deliberate practice, reaching for objectives just beyond your current ability. So one of those areas may be in how we connect with the client's current abilities, strengths, resources, experiences in their lives, etc. And that's essentially what Jesse and Joshua have done. For me, I think one of the interesting aspects, because I interacted heavily with the authors as they wrote, and it was interesting to me that you have these two really premier researchers, and a couple of things that in the first draft weren't reviewed that I thought might be important, and that is extra therapeutic change producing events, meaning taking advantage of shit that happens by accident but that may benefit the client. And we know, for example, that there is a significant and growing literature that talks about clients experiencing significant improvement both prior to meeting the therapist, actually simply making their appointment, and then secondly, within the first handful of visits. And as I think all therapists recognize, as they nod their head and the client may thank them for their brilliant clinical work for the first 4 sessions, most clinicians I meet are much more modest about claiming credit for that. They want to use that, I think, to benefit the client, while at the same time not saying it had to do with some brilliant intervention that they thought up at the moment. And that was one area that Jesse and Joshua, with a bit of prodding from me, went back and reviewed. And lo and behold, the gain in effect is really quite large.
I just want to add on that note, because you raised an important point about this sort of extra therapeutic change. And if for those of you who want to explore even the literature a little bit further, look up things about psychotherapy in terms of what they call sudden gains. They would call this as when things have a sudden improvement, right? That's really dramatic and may or may not be related to what's been done in the therapy session. So I interrupted you, Scott. Go on.
No, that's okay. One other thing that really jumped out at me in the work that they did was this review of the research on personal strengths. And of course, back in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, there was the solution-focused movement, the positive psychology movement. There were lots of claims that if we focused on client strengths, that you would have better outcomes. And it turns out that head-to-head reviews, at least in meta-analytic studies, find that those approaches are no different than problem-focused approaches. But that doesn't tell quite the whole story. And our co-editor, Sam Malins, did a really interesting study that I think has significant implications for how we think about what the client brings to the table in the room. And in that particular study, you'll probably recall if you read the chapter, what Sam found was those initial conversations with clients had a significant impact on outcome. And in particular, when the longer therapists spent diagnosing and describing clients' problems, the greater the likelihood that the outcomes were poor than if they cut to the chase and began to inquire about the client's abilities and strengths and times when they somehow managed to defeat or overcome the particular problem. So I think for me, at least, Darryl, those are two things from the client chapter that stand out among many.
Yeah, I mean, those are really interesting if we start to really pay attention to the clinical implication of this. Because I remember one particular case where I was working with this young adult, and he presented with anhedonic type of mood and really low, and things were not going well. And we were monitoring his outcomes. We were not going anywhere in the first 4 or 5 sessions. About the 5th or 6th, when he came in, he rated the thing, but he was telling me about something that happened in his life. He said that he broke up with his girlfriend, and I thought, oh my goodness, how much more bad can this get? Like, things are not going well for him, and on top of that, his key relationship with this one person in his life is now no longer going to be present for him. And then when I looked at the way he reported his well-being, his outcome scores were not what he said, and I struggled to kind of put meaning to what he was saying and what he put down on the measure. And I just told him what I was thinking. I said, I'm a bit confused in terms of how come the rating is actually quite dramatically higher. In this case, the literature, they would call this a sudden gain, but totally not what I would have thought intuitively. And he began to also talk about his own dissonance around that. But then he said something that was quite important. He said for the first time, he was doing something by choice. And it seems like a strange thing to say for how he might present himself, but he was talking something about his inner landscape, not just the things that are happening on the outside, but things that was happening on the inside. And at least for me, the key thing for me was this was not some kind of playbook of something to do. It was a pause book. It really made me pause, like stop and just like rethink the whole thing one more time, and then kind of tap into what he was saying about, for the first time, he was making something with agency, something that he was doing by choice. And we tried to find a way to amplify that a little bit more.
It's interesting, Darryl, a concept from the hypnosis literature that's been around for a long time is something called trance ratification. And trance ratification is an important concept because most people do not experience somnambulistic trances, meaning that they become deeply unconscious, are unaware of what's happened after the trance work. Most people experience trance work as a light, relaxed state. And it's important, according to the teachers of hypnosis, that clients actually ratify they're in a trance. That, in other words, that it's important to communicate to the person you are hypnotizing that they actually are hypnotized. To me, this is tied to some similar findings from the implementation literature. A study that we have just finished and that's being written up by a colleague of Jesse Owens, Joanna Drian, that found that if clinicians do not have a fit ratifying experience early on in their use of the measures,
right,
the chances of them setting them aside is very large. You have to have something that makes it believable, palpable, and I love the meaning that your client and you were able to attribute to the work that they were doing, that it was something different. It really was profound. It made a difference.
And I think it's also to be able to figure out a way to tap to that, because it's so counter everything that I'm experiencing and him saying, but then yet we are on the edge of what we know. So then the conversation is to create that reality of what the implication is and what this means for him, and do we attune to that a little bit more.
Perfect.
The other thing that stands out for me from this particular chapter, strangely, maybe it was at that time when I was thinking a lot about this concept, and then lo and behold, you guys address this issue. And I don't recall if the terminology was actually used, but the terminology refers to this thing called ecological fallacy. Ecological fallacy simply means that you take something that is meaningful on an average level and you try to apply that on an individual level, right? So it's kind of like a bit of a statistical stereotyping, if you like. Like you think that, if you have this profile, it means that you are likely to benefit from that. And the example that you guys raised that was really useful was this. It says something like, suppose if you were female and has generalized anxiety disorder, and then in this particular clinical trial, they found that people at that age who had GAD and they received X treatment, they were 87% chance of getting good outcomes, right? So that's the clinical study that they found. And then you try to apply that to the individual. So we ask the question, this particular individual that you see right now, what are the odds of this particular person with GAD at that age is likely to benefit? Is it 87%? And the ecological fallacy is to assume that yes, you have an 87% chance of improving. But it's a fallacy because we do not know beforehand, right? We do not know beforehand because there's so many other factors that makes this individual unique and different, and we can't predict whether she will be exactly like those people in that group. And the take-home message for me is it sounds rather simple, but if we could see why this is such a slippery fallacy, is that the assumptions that we can quickly make about the thing that I guess most of us were trained with, this idea of the what works for whom, right? Figure this, figure that out, and then you get that. That's like the medical pill model, like you get this and you get that, and that's what you need to do. But then the solution may sound so simple when I say it, but it's literally an idea of continuous calibration for each client that you meet, right? You continuously calibrate, adjust, you reify, you kind of tighten the loop, and you be responsive to that. And to me, that really stood out a lot from this chapter on the implications of what it means to work with one person at a time.
Thanks, Daryl, for that. I think there are some also very controversial pieces of research reviewed by Jesse and Joshua that probably emerge because of the ecological fallacy. That is constantly trying to look for group differences. So right now, whether that is based on gender identity, sexual orientation, race, etc., at an aggregate group level, the data that we have among many of those fronts says no difference. And so that might mean, well, you just do your usual CBT with them based on whatever their diagnosis is. When in fact, what I think Jesse and Joshua argue so persuasively is that we have to figure out at the idiosyncratic level what works, as opposed to the nomothetic level, what works for this individual person. From a deliberate practice perspective, it also may mean I need to find out, do I exhibit a pattern of non-random errors in my work with particular groups of people? So,
Scott, sorry, I need to ask you to elaborate on that, because you did talk about that on the first webinar, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page, can you just kind of give us a gist of what you mean by random and non-random error?
For me, this is a really important distinction. And fit, measuring your results and responding in the moment. And therapists are, I think, again, mostly very good at this, except when they're not. And the day is long. We have many clients, and it's easy to miss some nuance in the work. And so FIT helps you respond. It addresses random errors, stuff that comes up that you can plan for. It's not part of who you are. It's not some recurring pattern. Non-random errors are those which are part of our makeup, things we miss or do on an ongoing basis, usually outside of awareness, that may have a negative impact on either our growth or the particular client. And with regard to the issues that Jesse and Joshua review, again, the fallacy comes in saying, since there are no differences, we can just do the same with everybody. That's been the hope, I think, of the evidence-based practice movement. You just reach the formulary, take it out, and apply it. But really, one thing we could do is look at some point whether or not we are uniformly effective across different people's diagnoses, age groups, etc., for those deliberate practice opportunities. Well, I was just going to say, I know that we promised to talk about chapter 5 as well. So Daryl, take just a moment, because we wanted to leave some time for people to interact and talk with us about their experience of these chapters and anything else related to the book that you read. Let's talk just briefly about chapter 5 and anything at all that stood out for you.
Yeah, brilliant. So while we kind of tee that up for chapter 5, and for those of you on this call, if you like to, feel free to go into the chat and also tell us what stands out, what stood out for you from chapter 3 on the client factors too, before we get into chapter 5. For me, what I was really excited to read this, because it's John Norcross, right, and his colleague, and I'm a big fan of his work for a long time. So it's kind of a bit like a fanboy just waiting to see a new album release or a new song release from somebody, and his work's that way for me. I think this is such an important topic. He's been tackling this topic for a lot of his publications, a lot of his work. So we are really glad that he could be involved with us in this particular edited book. The thing that really stood out for me, actually, I kind of like quietly chuckled when he had this suggestion at the end. So the book's kind of laid out in terms of the evidence, and then the principles, and some suggestions, right? And one of the suggestions he wrote was the idea about what would Carl Rogers do. And it speaks to my bias, it speaks to my slant, and I think it's really important for me to think about that. And in the social sciences, we call this introjection, which is, if you're a Christian, the saying about what would Jesus do, what would somebody do, what was your mentor do, that kind of idea is really useful, because you sort of get out of yourself and try and see from a different perspective. And Carl Rogers particularly embodies that quite significantly for me, and I'll tell you why. So his work, we all know this from a lot of psych and counseling textbook, and I often felt like it doesn't do it justice. And only much later that I began to read some of his work, and I thought, okay, there's really quite many layers of what he is saying. Really impressed me. But then what really impressed me later on was actually listening beyond the Gloria tapes, beyond the stuff that some of you might be familiar with, beyond all those kind of recordings, to kind of watch him doing his work. And one footnote, he was one of the first few psychologists to say that psychotherapy needs to measure their outcomes and record what's happening as well. He's one of the first few pioneers with those big reel-to-reel tapes, and he would do all of that. And the thing that really struck me about the way he conducts a session, one obvious fact is that if you actually watch some of his works, he rarely asks questions. And it's pretty striking how a conversation can go without somebody being, jumping with questions. But then the other thing comes to my mind when I watch him is that how much of an emotional experiencing that must be for the client, and how moving and how much dynamism there is not just a parroting, which sometimes the critique about his work is. So for me, hearing both authors mention this in the chapter, it's sort of a prompt for us to sometimes think about, okay, the people that you admire, like what would they do at this moment? How would you embody that, just to give you a bit of a different perspective, just to shift your viewpoint a little bit more. I really like that. What about you, Scott?
Oh, a couple of things. The first is I feel compelled to share this dream I had in 1980. I think it was 85. I was at the first Evolution of Psychotherapy conference. I'd been in psychoanalysis with a Winnicott trained analyst for close to 3 years by this time. The experience of that was to seriously become more and more depressed as I continued to talk, and with this person who was a very kind person. It just wasn't helping me. So I go to Evolution, I meet Carl Rogers briefly, and this was the very first Evolution of Psychotherapy conference. And 1 or 2 nights into it, I have this dream that I'm told that I'm going to meet Carl Rogers, and I'm thinking of this introject that you're talking about here, Carol. And I said, wow, that would be great. And I have a personal audience with him. And I go in, and by this time, he was in a wheelchair. And I come in, and I can still see this image in my mind's eye. He has this beautiful multicolored quilt over his legs with all these different patches and pieces of different colors. And I walk in, and he looks at me, and he says, "You're okay, Scott." That was it. And when I woke up from that dream the next morning, true story, I decided to quit psychoanalysis. And it was really one of the best decisions I made. And I never paid for that session, which was an even sort of cream on the top of all of that, because he was helpful with it without knowing it. That was, as you were telling me about this, I was seeing that.
Just so you know, if you didn't see this, Scott, I see a lot of affirmative response where people say that you quit psychoanalysis. Tom and Bogdan.
It was really an amazing. The whole experience was amazing. But that dream, for me in that particular chapter, something that's becoming more important, I think, the older I get, and I suppose less interested I am in solving big questions in psychotherapy, is his discussion of the real relationship. And this is something that both John reviews and that Bruce Wampold talks about in his work more of late. And I think it's easy, or at least for me, it was easy to get distracted from all of that. When I was seeing the analyst as part of going to school, when I ran out of things to talk about, it was interesting to me. He suggested I lay on a couch, and then he sat behind me so I couldn't see him. I can remember feeling the distance and coldness of that as an intervention personally. Real relationship, as I understand it and as reviewed, was the therapist realistically and genuinely liking the person that they're working with, and the client actually feeling that. And now there's someone on the call that I'm probably going to embarrass a bit here. That's Steen Olsen. And if you don't know Steen is a physiotherapist out of Denmark, and he became, along with a colleague, Charlotte Krogh, became quite interested in fit, mostly because they had lots of mechanical measures in physical therapy, but they both thought that there was this important piece about relationship and about asking people about how they felt about things and relating to people. So they were at all the workshops in the beginning. We chatted briefly, and then one day, mostly because I I just had this sense that these two not just were interested in fit, but they actually kind of liked me as a person. And Steen, I went up to Steen and I said, I think it was Steen, not Charlotte, and I said, "Hey, I've got this problem in my shoulder, and I'm thinking of having surgery. I think it's probably a rotator cuff thing." The next day, Steen and Charlotte, they show up with this equipment that they're going to give me for my neck and stuff. And then they listen to me talk about this for probably 20 minutes before eventually getting to this exercise that they taught me. I just had this sense that they genuinely liked me. They genuinely cared for me. And after 2 visits, 2 chats, I never had rotator cuff surgery because of that. Thank you, Steen. But thanks mostly just for being a nice guy who showed compassion and concern. And I think it's easy to miss that in all of our technique-filled world. Hey, are you moving your fingers? Hey, are you tapping on people? Hey, have you done the right diagnosis? And without that genuine liking, I think we miss a big part. And that's, for me, one piece that I really appreciated. And the question is, how do you deliberately practice that? And I'll say something a bit strange. I think you genuinely practice it in a way by, number one, recognizing when you don't genuinely like the person you're with, admitting it to yourself, talking with your colleagues about it, and in some instances, acting in the best interest of the client and saying, I have someone else that I think might be a better fit for you. And that's hard to do, because the assumption, I think, in psychotherapy is you're supposed to be able to connect with everybody. And as we just reviewed in this first part of this conversation, Daryl, that's just unrealistic. So anyway, long-winded answer.
No, I think it's wonderful you shared that, because to me, the idea that psychotherapy should not be an individual sport. It should be a communal endeavor. It should be something that we know our limits, we know our constraints, but we also understand the wider impact of relationship that's invisible in the therapy room as well. And if we are not going to be helpful, and we know there's some constraints, that we have other people that we can turn to and link them up with. So I think that's really important. I think that speaks a lot about this idea of not only the chapter that talks about real relationship, but also about emotional expression, like to say about how we feel in certain things, to also express about our own limitations. I one time heard this person in a consult was telling me about how much she was struggling with a particular way of working with this client. And as she was talking, I noticed that this therapist really cared for her. And I said, like, one, do you think your client knows that? And based on assumptions, it could be felt in the room. And I said, like, let's think a bit about how would you convey that in service of the therapeutic endeavor? How would you even explicate that? And for her, thinking about that moved her to tears, because she worries a lot about her. She feels like she's a nurturing role to this particular client, like a mother almost, but she was not wrapped up to the point like it's so fused, and enmeshed. And she figured out a way to kind of broach that. And later she got the feedback that several sessions later, she got the feedback from the client that it was a thing that really moved her significantly in a strange, non-implicit way, a non-explicit way, but in a way that she felt that, I could feel like somebody cares. Somebody really cares.
Thanks, Daryl, for that. Sometimes in my consults with clinicians, when we're looking at an individual case, it's not often, but it will occur to me to say, do you like working with this person? In my workshops, I'll also do a bit of a joke where I'll say, everybody has a client named Bob, who, when they look at their appointment book, they grit their teeth and think, oh, I wish Bob would drop out like my other clients, but Bob refuses. It's that piece, I think, that most of us know. It may not be a subject of deliberate practice, but if we take a look at our low RES clients, we might be able to isolate if, in fact, this is an issue for us, that we just can't find something to connect with people in a realistic, genuine way that's likable. And I know lots of therapists say that they do try to do that purposefully in their work when they're approaching clients. They purposefully search for things they care about and like about from the client.
So let's just take a moment to zoom out before we field some questions that you guys might have, especially about chapters 3 and 5. The book is one that's not meant to be read from chapter to chapter. In fact, it's a bit of a choose your own adventure type of thing, right? Like it's not meant to be something that you go digesting the whole thing, because building from better results, the field guide is meant to be an expansion after you start to complete the TDPA, the Taxonomy of Deliberate Practice Activities worksheet. Do it for yourself, and then getting a supervisor, a coach, somebody who knows your work to also do that, because that will give you the stage, the platform to examine, to kind of step out. And as what Scott was saying about non-random errors, to be able to look and to see what are some patterns. Can we solve for some patterns instead of solving for specifics? And that's tricky because it's a different point of view that you're taking a look at your work and trying to see what's a good leverage of things to work on.
I was going to say, Daryl, that you'll recall that when they had external APA as a publisher. I really value APA. They do something as publishers that most publishers have given up. They're very stringent and rigorous in their review of the books and the chapters. And so we had to send, after we completed writing, we had to send the chapter off. They hired, or I don't know, they contacted 3 external reviewers that we didn't know about. One of the reviewers kept saying, this isn't a real great book to read from chapter to chapter. There's no continuity between the chapters. Don't they want to put into, and they had missed we said, well, that's the first book. So if you read the first book, one chapter to the next, that's how that book is written, better results. But this one really is, as you say, choose your own adventure based on where you're at, follow the map that's presented in the office, and it will take you to the place that might give you the resources you need to address your specific area of deliberate practice.
Mm-hmm. So let's just take some time. You guys, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to put it into the chat. If you would like to speak directly, put a hands up on the Zoom so that we know that you would like to speak, and we could get you to say out your questions if you wish. So either type it or put it there. But I want to circle back to the beginning, because it didn't strike me until when I had a relook about this, something that you and Mark mentioned, Scott, in chapter 1. And this was somewhere, I think, in probably page 10 of the.
Wow. That's amazing memory. Page 10. Okay.
No, I'm cheating. I'm looking at it right now.
Oh, okay. All right.
So it says, truly the goal of DP, the goal of deliberate practice, is neither proficiency nor mastery. So interesting. It's not about building skills in that way. Rather, it is all about continuously reaching for objectives that lie just beyond one's current ability. It's moving towards like a kind of an edge of what we know. And think about that for a second, because I think most of us, at least the way that we're schooled, we're taught to improve. We're taught about increasing skills, but this is somewhat slightly different. It's not about just amassing and acquiring all these little skills. It's really moving towards the edge of our abilities and to understand where is that edge and where do we need to go.
And as such, I'll just add, Daryl, it's often disruptive in the beginning as we challenge automaticity, the things that we have come to do and learned to do, and we do them at an unconscious level so that we can focus our limited cognitive resources on new things. So when you first start trying to reach, chances are your organization of your work, your conceptualization of it, and perhaps even your execution of it will suffer a bit. It won't look as, how do I say this, pretty. In the same way that a graduate student's work is not pretty or elegant. Their mind is open, they're not certain about what they do. That's in a way what deliberate practice starts to cause to happen, a disruption of those established patterns.
Yeah, Cindy here. Hi, everybody.
Cindy.
Hi. So the idea of uh, when someone has a score, this was your story, Daryl. When someone has a score on the ORS or the SRS, and you look at it and it doesn't make sense, right? And so you have this conversation around it. I think that's a really important piece, right? That people can lean in on. It reminds me of, I'm not sure if it was the last webinar or something else recent, Scott, you did. You said it was for you to, I think a really great exercise is, especially when you first start using the SRS, is to uh, do your own calibration, right? When you ask them to do it, so you do your own calibration of what you think they're going to say, right? And then see, right? And then what's the difference there? I think that's a really important tool.
One thing we do know is that while therapists' outcomes don't seem to improve, their over time, their ability to, or their alignment with clients' sense of how the relationship is going at the nomothetic, the aggregate level tends to increase. So clinicians tend to get better at guessing how their clients are feeling about the relationship. And I think the thing that you're mentioning here is a way to supercharge that, as opposed to waiting while the client fills it out. Answer the questions yourself, and then think through, once they leave, not on the client's dime, but once they leave, what was discrepant? Where did you miss? Why did you think it was this way and they said another way? Keep score. I really like this idea that Daryl talks about not making a pattern out of one experience. So instead, gather data, keep it in a notebook for a while as you try to get closer to the client's sense of their experience of the relationship. Thanks, Cindy.
I just want to quickly underscore this one thing. I have not stopped this since realizing how bad I was at predicting this. So the thing that I guess, Cindy, you were mentioning was this rate and predict idea. So the thing that I normally do now is when there's a client scoring their session rating scale, their alliance rating of the session, I'm also scoring like what Scott was mentioning. However, what I do now is I literally quickly scribble down on my notepad each of the 4 domains. So we have got the relationships, the goals, the methods, and overall. I quickly just put down a number there. The reason is because I can smell my mind tricking myself. Like if the client said that, and I go, oh yeah, I kind of knew that. Yeah, I knew it all along. Yeah. I could feel my mind wanting to always be affirming and agreeable like that way. But once I commit down to paper, the evidence of my own is there. And what's interesting is the disconfirmation is actually really useful. To me, the disconfirmation, you can't help but don't feel good about the dissonance, and you want to understand. So you be inquisitive, you be trying to understand what's missing and all. And the thing that when I first started doing is the one thing that really stood out for me from a pattern point of view was the constant feedback that actually I was too abstract. I talked a bit at a kind of a higher level on the ladder of abstraction. I talked too much on that like metaphorical and too much higher abstraction. I was not concrete enough for these people. And it was interesting because that was the thing I struggled, and to figure out a way to be more specific. And that became something I had to work on. Was it Tom? Tom, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say something. I was reading chapter 3 and I kept on thinking of a mentor. It was a philosopher that I knew when I was 20. And he just made a passing comment. He says, if you're going to counsel someone, you have to, he said, you have to realize the radical individuality of each human being. And when he said that, it just struck me, and it stayed with me all my life. But I think that's what was really hitting me from chapter 3. And I was taking a walk the other day, and I go for a walk, and I like to watch the flowers and the trees, and just the individuality of every tree and every flower. It's kind of crazy. So it's almost overwhelming. So I think we try to control it. So how to not to control that?
Tom, you have a way of sharing stories that really gives me chills, like in other avenues that we spoke to. But it's so true. Like I'm actually currently reading this one strange book called I think you're seeing this in reverse, but it's Songwriters on Songwriting. And somewhere, so I can't remember which songwriter was saying this, but it was saying about why should you write another song? Like there's so many songs in the world already, right? And this particular songwriter says that, well, if you write the song that only you can write, then yes, you should do it. Yeah. So I think in therapy, like it's how to suspend, how to have those knowledge. I mean, we can't just go in pretending that we don't know anything, but how we suspend at least those things that we know and just kind of put it beside us, not in front of us, and to just listen to the individual, the uniqueness of each person. That's a real challenge.
Because the mind wants to make a category. The mind wants to go and say, "Oh, I got it," but you don't. Yeah.
I was thinking about something that I think, Daryl, you have brought to this area of deliberate practice that dovetails with the conversation you and Tom are having, and that is, I feel sad that I think that the most attractive part of the field guide to most will be the exercises. I feel really sad about that.
Why is that?
Because I think the most important part, and it fits with this radical individualism that Tom mentions from his mentor and what you've been saying, is that part of the way people learn, especially early on, is by imitation. We copy people's behavior. That's where you end up with these rote sayings in our field, like "what I hear you saying is," and so you must be feeling very, and they have all the empathic feeling of embracing a tree without leaves. But what you brought to the table, and which I think is really the most important part of the book, are the principles. So these researchers reviewed all this research, and then they squeezed it down to a set of core principles. And the key to that, the important part about it rather, is that those principles can be operationalized at the therapist and client levels in diverse ways. Ways that when you enact them, each of you on this call, they're going to be unique incarnations of that activity based on your biology, your experience, your location, your cultural background, etc. And that's, I think, a super important part of this. Not that deliberate practice has us all trying to say the same thing and do the same thing. And believe me, that's where my mind was going at the beginning of the deliberate practice project. How are we going to attend to all this granular detail in therapist behavior and get them to be masters of that? And the principle piece frees you from that. It frees you from trying to copy and replicate all of these very specific context and person specific behaviors, and instead think about, how would I embody this particular principle, the principles that John Norcross and that Joshua and Jesse outline in the chapter?
I mean, this came out like years ago when we first started the Difficult Conversations Therapy Project. We were really just trying to help people with dealing with curly situations and difficult stuff that they have to handle in therapy. They are rare, but they happen and they are difficult. And because of its rarity, people don't really learn much. We are just trying to survive and be keeping afloat at those times. And Sharon and I, when we first started doing this thing, we were transcribing exactly word for word what people were saying, and we're trying to think about, okay, how to tweak the phrase and all that. But Sharon and I, we thought this is kind of like not efficient use of time. That was the first thing that crossed our minds, is like, oh, this is too laborious. But then as we kind of like looked at this, and Sharon had this qualitative analysis background, so she was able to kind of like say, wait, can we start to look at this from a pattern point of view? I was like, well, that's speaking my language. Let's do that. And then suddenly we're thinking, wait, what if we actually start to give a handle to help people have some kind of fast and frugal, rule of thumb, principle-based kind of organization, right? And just give them that so that they could do everything like what Scott was saying, just do everything that's idiosyncratic to the therapist of how they can explain certain things, how they will word certain things. And it doesn't even have to be like verbally fluent. We're not looking for fluency. We're just looking for a raw expression of something that's unspoken and brought to speech and shared in conversation. That's the nature of therapy. And that was the genesis, I guess.
It was the genesis, and to me, it was so liberating when you started to talk about it, and it was also the piece that I know you'll recall, Daryl, that when we were trying to give feedback to the authors, they were great, all of them, amazing minds in terms of researching and reporting the evidence. We struggled, and we provided the most feedback around the principles.
That's right.
Can you state this in some way that is a clear, yes, and concise, that captures the essence of the research and allows people, frees people to enact this in ways consistent with who they were as people?
Totally. Now, you guys on the call, you're more than likely already having some kind of systematic way of tracking your outcomes and your lines. Great. And then next step, do the TDPA. That's quite an overwhelming document. Take your time to do through that, because that's going to at least set you up for a leverage point. But make sure, I know this is kind of pedantic to keep reminding this, but make sure it's tied to your baseline outcomes. Make sure it's linked that way. And then go through the chapters to see what are some areas that you think will be good leverage to actually yield better outcomes for you, and work through that. Give it some time, like it doesn't grow overnight. And pick the brains of many other different fields, other domains to try and learn from that. Whilst you're doing that, I would even suggest that if you are really game and conscientious, if you really want to harness this because you're so motivated to do that, I would suggest just the habit of capturing concise therapy learnings weekly. Weekly therapy learnings is kind of put down based on what you're going through, put a serialized number, put a date, and just look through your calendar to think about the people you've met at the end of the work week. What strikes you? So it could be something significant. It could be something that you didn't imagine hearing yourself go into this particular conversation, but it's noteworthy to you, or it could be a blunder, right? But then here's the next thing. Try to see if you could notice, as you do this week after week, any pattern emerge, and then name it in a way that only you can remember. And maybe that might even become your principle, a guiding light, a guiding principle for yourself. This is something that you grow or you cultivate in this garden of knowledge of yours. And it could be something that you engage with individually, but also if you're in the midst of other practitioners. When people share these things, it's just so resonant to a lot of other people, mainly because they might be stealing your knowledge too. They go like, that's a good idea, let me put that down too. Or you may hear other people's ideas that inspire some other ideas, and it would help to percolate on that. So good things to play around with.
We've got just a short bit of time left, just 3 minutes, gang. Any other comments or questions? Yeah, Bogdan.
First of all, thank you for giving us the recording of the previous webinar. It was wonderful that I had the chance to review it over and over. And I'm interested in this idea. One of my goals is to move learning of the fit and the deliberate practice principles as early as possible in the training, because from my point of view, I think if you spend a lot of time becoming a true believer in some sort of model, you have less flexibility to adopt fit than if you have been exposed to it early. So this is what bothers me. And I think the distinction you made between purposeful practice and deliberate practice, but in a way that you can introduce at least principle of deliberate practice, if not the practice itself, early on. So if you have some ideas, some lead, some thoughts about it, I'm more than willing to learn.
So Bogdan, and I know we have several people who are primarily in a teaching kind of setting. I know Ryan is a professor. To me, it's a really crucial role, this next generation of clinicians. And by the way, I'm not saying this for any other reason than my experiences, it reflects this, that these new students are some of the smartest people I've ever met. I mean, they are wicked smart, and I think they're prepared to do something different than has been the case for the last 50 years in our field, since in the US, the first and second Boulder conferences. So one thing I think we could do is stop assuming that they don't know anything before they get trained, because the data seem to suggest that they know a fair bit, and that their ability in terms of interpersonal skills, facilitative interpersonal skills, is highly predictive of how effective they are after all their training. And so right now we sort students, or we have traditionally sorted students based on how well they can pass a test like the GRE, when this has absolutely no predictive power, in my estimation, of how helpful they are as clinicians. So I would say I want to get my students in front of people quickly, as opposed to waiting for 2 years. That I'm thinking of PhD programs mostly here, as opposed to a master's level program, which many are right in there doing now. Secondly, let's assume that they're already helpful people until we're proven otherwise, and then give them targeted feedback, measure their impact, and feedback targeted to their specific deficits, whatever those might be. Are they in the area of relationship, connection with clients, hope and expectancy, therapist factors, or structuring factors? Most of my graduate school experience was on structuring factors. Here's how you do it. You do the assessment first, then you do the treatment plan, then you deliver the treatment, etc. And all of those things are great ideas, but they're also very limited in terms of their leverage on outcome. So I think it's a great goal, Bogdan, and I know Ryan would be right there with you. I apologize if other people are doing in the same position and teaching, but.
So I think we're up to the clock. Just want to say a big thank you for being involved in this call, and for those of you who are also not on this call but on the first 100, make sure to get your copy of your book, whether it's an e-copy or a paperback, that's coming to you, I believe, by the end of May. That will be the release. And
23rd.
As you read the other chapters, please feel free to let Scott and I know your thoughts and some things that strikes you by the book, or you got other comments as you read through the book as well. We love to hear how you're interacting with this field guide. And
we'd also love it if whether you liked the book or not, if you once you have the whole thing in your hands, leave a review on the various book sites. We'd really appreciate it. All right, everybody. Thanks so much. Good to see you all. Take care.